Well, Happy New Year and welcome. If you're joining us for the first time, welcome. Um, if you're one of our old friends, welcome back. Welcome everyone to Consumer Action's first webinar of 2021. Get ready to be amazed. We have a great webinar planned for you today. My name is Linda Williams. I'm a community outreach and training manager at Consumer Action, coming to you live from sunny Fontana, California. Today's webinar is on the impact of COVID-19 on affordable housing, and we asked the question, once the eviction moratoriums are lifted nationwide, if corrective action is not taken, are we facing an eviction tsunami? Our guest speakers today are Miss Bridgett Simmons, backed by popular demand. She's a staff attorney for the National Housing Law Project. And joining us for the first time is Mr. Sam Gilman. He is the co-founder of the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Center. Before we get started today, I have some housekeeping to go over. I need to introduce you to Consumer Action and review the agenda so you'll know what's in store today. But first, I need to thank our sponsors. Today's webinar is a series of webinars that Consumer Action is hosting in response to the COVID-19 crisis. So, on behalf of the entire staff at CA, I would like to thank our sponsors for this opportunity. Now, as the announcer stated, when you join the webinar, you are in listen only mode. However, if you have any questions during the presentations, and we hope that you have a ton, please type them in the question box on the right of the screen. Now, if you're on Twitter, you can use that platform to ask your questions. Our handle is at Consumer Action, or you can use our go-to hashtag, which is CA Webinars. My colleague, Nelson Santiago, he will facilitate the question and answer segment at the end of both presentations. He will be capturing all of your questions and he will present them to the speakers at the end. So let's keep Nelson busy and give him all of those questions. This webinar is being recorded. It will be made available to you along with tons and tons of handouts tomorrow afternoon at the latest. Now, very important. At the end of the webinar, you will receive a survey about today's webinar. Please, please, please complete the survey before signing off. Those surveys are very important to us. So let me introduce you now to my agency, Consumer Action. What do we do at Consumer Action? We're, well, as it says there on the screen, under Welcome to Consumer Action, through education and advocacy, we fight for strong consumer rights and policies that promote fairness and financial prosperity for all consumers, but especially for underrepresented consumers nationwide. How do we accomplish this? We advance consumer rights by referring complaints through our national hotline, by publishing and making available to you free educational materials in multiple languages, through our monthly newsletters, The Insider and Scamgram, our quarterly publication, CA News, and by advocating for consumers in the media and before lawmakers. Now, another important arm of consumer action is the outreach department. Hey, Nelson and I are constantly reaching out to community based organizations that serve low to moderate income and marginalized communities to engage them, to teach them how to use the free education materials to help their clients reach their financial goals, and by providing free trainings like the webinar today. Now, since quite a few of you are new to consumer action, let me take a couple of minutes just to show you how to download materials from our website. Let's say you are interested in our COVID-19 educational project. Well, once you click on the green bar, the dark green bar, and our website is there at the bottom of the screen, but as soon as you click on that dark green bar, it will land you on our COVID-19 educational project page. Now, when you're on the page, if you click on the words resource guides, you will find valuable resources for consumers that are impacted by COVID-19. But if you click on the words fact sheets, it will lead you to fact sheets that includes topics like fair housing rights affected by the pandemic, estate planning, critical decisions for uncertain times, financial assistance for undocumented workers, and you can download and print these fact sheets and make them available to your clients as well. Now, Consumer Action is a 501c3 organization. We're supported by memberships and donations like $5, $10, $15, and grants. And at the end of the webinar, there would be information about how you can make that $5, $10 donation to Consumer Action. Let's take a look at the agenda really quickly so you know where we're headed. In Consumer Action, we firmly believe in making learning fun. So whether we are virtual or in a face-to-face training, we open up all of our trainings by testing your knowledge on the topic of the training. With one of our most popular games, How Much Do You Know? We get into How Much Do You Know in a few seconds. Following the game, we will move into the feature presentations on the impact of COVID-19 on affordable housing. Ms. Simmons will be our first speaker, followed by Mr. Gilman. Nelson will lead the question and answer segment. Following both presentations, I will come back, tell you how you can donate to Consumer Action, give you some information on upcoming webinars, and wrap up. So let's get started with the first game. Come on, let's roll out that first poll question. Okay, first poll question. Households are becoming exposed to crowded housing conditions with levels higher than those prior to the Great Recession. Prior to the Great Recession. Now, is that true or is that false? Households are becoming exposed to crowded housing conditions with levels higher than those prior to the Great Recession. Okay, don't overthink it. Last chance. Okay, let's close the poll and look at the response. So 89% believe it's true, 11% thinks it's false. Well, according to Urban Institute Housing and Housing Finance, that is true. And this article will be among the handouts in your packet. Let's move to the next question. Okay, true or false? As many as 64 million people in the United States live in multi generational households. 64 million? Come on now. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Couple more seconds. Okay, let's close the poll and look at the result. Wow. 95% of you think that's true, and only 5% think it's false. Well, according to the Center for American Progress, that's actually true. Okay, let's move to the next question. You guys are good. Okay, let me see how you do on this one. True or false? Rental cost burden is defined as a household who pays over 30% of their income towards rent. Is that true or is that false? Don't overthink it. Come on, a couple more seconds. I see you changing your mind back and forth. Okay, let's close the poll. Okay, so 90% thinks it's true and 10% says it's false. Well, according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and this article will be among the handouts in your packet, that is true. Okay, let's launch the last poll question. Okay, speaking of rent burden, although Americans of all ages rent, older households tend to be more rent burdened than younger families. Is that true or is that false? Older household tends to be more rent burdened than young families. Is that true? Is that false? Okay, let's close the poll. See the results. 62% says it's true, 38% says it's false. Well, according to Pew, American families face a growing rent burden. That is actually true. And that article also will be in your packet. And one other note, um, according to that report households that are rent burdened for a year or more are less likely to be able to buy a house. Well, I want to thank you so much for participating in the game. I hope you enjoyed it. Now, break out your pen and your paper. Get ready to take a few notes. Get ready to be amazed as I introduce our dynamic speakers. Our first speaker is Bridgett A. Simmons. Bridgett Simmons is a passionate housing advocate who just happens to be an attorney. She's a staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project. Bridget's work focuses on the preservation of HUD subsidized multifamily housing, healthy housing, and voucher use. Bridget joined the National Housing Law Project in September 2017 as the second David B. Bryson Fellow. As the Bryson Fellow, Bridget managed the editing process for the fifth edition of the HUD Housing Program's Tenants' Rights book, also known as the Green Book, or if you're a housing advocate, it's called the Bible in your office. Bridget is a 2017 graduate of Georgetown University Law School and a 2011 graduate of Florida A&M University. While at Georgetown University Law School, she participated in the Harrison Institute Affordable Housing Transaction Clinic, assisting DC residents in operating a multifamily housing property purchase via the Tenants Opportunity Purchase Act. Our next guest speaker is Mr. Sam Goodman. Mr. Goodman is the co-founder of the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project that was founded in April 2020 to respond to the urgent questions about housing, homelessness, and community recovery during the spread of COVID-19. Sam works at the intersection of law, policy, and data. He was previously senior manager of strategy and special projects at Gill Education. Before that, he worked at McKinsey. He was the co-founder and CEO of a political advocacy group called Common Sense Action. He is also a JD and MPP student at Harvard University, where he is the policy director and student attorney with the Harvard Tenant Advocacy Project. Welcome to Consumer Action, Sam. Now, before I turn the controls over to Miss Simmons, I have a burning question for you. Uh, this 30% rule, this 30% rule that's rooted in 1969 housing public rate regulation that says that um, you shouldn't pay any more than 30% of your income for rent. Somebody who's trying to rent a two-bedroom apartment making minimum wage can't even afford to pay 30%. With the cost of housing outpacing income, is this rule outdated? I'll let you answer that as you go on with your presentation. You have the control, Ms. Simmons.
Help if I took myself off of mute. Thank you, Ms. Williams, and thank you to Consumer Action for having me once again here to join you all to discuss the impacts of COVID on housing. As previously mentioned, I'm a staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project. NHLP is a national organization based in San Francisco, California. We provide technical assistance to attorneys who provide legal representation to low-income families, both those who are renters and low-income homeowners. In addition to providing technical assistance, we also provide policy support at the federal, state, and local level in regards to housing policies to expand housing opportunities for marginalized communities. We also bring impact litigation in regards to housing policies, and we've been able to partner with our coalition with a group of advocates throughout the country called the Housing Justice Network to really impact policy and how policy is shaped throughout the country at all levels of government. So turning to the question about affordability. The term affordable is a relative term. So when we are making an assessment about housing affordability, we must ask, for whom is housing affordable? Experts generally say that the maximum a family should pay for housing is 30% of their income. Any more than 30% and a family is considered cost burden. which means that they often will have to make tough decisions about how to stretch their incomes. Sometimes this looks like being late on bills or foregoing or cutting back on medical care and other necessary items. When discussing access to housing, the housing programs typically focus on three categories of families: extremely low income, very low income, or low income families. For extremely low income families, for every 36 affordable and available homes that are in existence, there are 100 low income renters who are in need of housing. So 71% of extremely low income renters are also severely house burden or cost burden, meaning that these families, when you say someone is severely house burden, that means that the family is contributing more than half of their income towards covering housing expenses. As one would imagine, those who are extremely low income are more likely to be severely housing burden or cost burden than other groups. Housing is made affordable generally through a federal or state program. These programs subsidize a portion of a family's. So moving to the second bullet point about how is housing made affordable. Housing is generally made affordable through these federal or state subsidy programs. And so what does it mean when a property has a subsidy? It simply means that the program pays a portion of the family's rent. Most notably from the federal programs, you've probably heard of Housing Choice Vouchers, Project-Based Section 8, LIHTC, or public housing. Other mechanisms to make housing more affordable include preservation laws. And preservation laws essentially a levy where or how much rent can be increased, or rent or use restrictions are placed on the property for X amount of years. In the federal context, the federal government had a preservation program called ELIPRA and LELIPRA, which preserved the affordability restrictions on properties where a federally backed loan was prepaid. And finally, in some markets, properties are naturally affordable. And that means that the affordability at the property isn't subsidized or isn't limited due to rent or use restrictions. So very rare, as it says on the slide, very rarely is it the case that market measures are keeping affordable housing keeping housing affordable. And so one thing that I would note, which is separate from the market, but it impacts the market, is that in some jurisdictions, they have something called rent control. And so what rent control essentially does is it allows for the property owner to increase rents at the property, but it limits how much that rent can be increased. So our friends at the National Low Income Housing Coalition annually publishes a report assessing access to housing for extremely low income families. According to their study, no state has an adequate supply of affordable rental housing for the lowest income renters. The need for affordable housing has only been exacerbated by the current public health and economic crisis. This chart shows the percentages of families who are severely rent burdened organized by their income. So severely cost burden, once again, means that these families are paying more than 50% of their income towards housing costs. And as you can see, extremely low income families make up a majority of severely cost burden renters. And so just as a reminder, extremely low income families tend to be characterized as those who are more at risk for housing instability, who have lower incomes, because they're extremely low income families, their income is either at the poverty level or at 30% of the area's median income. So these folks are likely to face the most housing instability. So this graph is an indication that the current market does not effectively provide affordable housing for all of our neighbors. Here we have a graph describing who are extremely low income renters. Most extremely low income families include a family member who works full or part time, as you can see by the wedge that says, 30% of extremely low income renters are in the labor force, where 43% of the pie of the portion who are in the labor force, they work full time, and 34% of those who are in the labor force work part time. And then additionally, extremely low income families also include seniors and those who have families that have a disability. The 2019 survey of consumer finances found that wealth disparities between families of different racial and ethnic identities wealth disparity continues to persist. In the study, the Fed found that a typical white family had 8 times the wealth of a typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Hispanic family. Here in this graph, you can see extremely low income families identify as either American Indian or Black non-Hispanic. And once again, these graphs are brought to you from our friends at the National Low Income Coalition, and I think you'll be able to use these links to find them. So I just wanted to share additional information about the coalition's report on the gap. So I apologize, the video isn't working, but we can explain through it. So as I mentioned, the coalition, they annually assess the need for affordable housing at the national as well as the state level. So in addition to looking at nationally, what is the data in and around affordable housing, you can also look at the data for your state. And to find this wonderful report, you can, as the search indicates, you can Google National Low Income Housing Coalition or NLIHC and the gap, and you'll be able to pull up this report. And I also included the link to the coalition's report at the end of my slides. You can, when you land on this page, you'll see a map of the country, and it shows, based on these 4 colors, where housing is most needed. And you can, once again, click on your state to see the need for housing to view the coalition's assessment. You can also, if you are familiar with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, you can also just go to the bottom of their website, regardless of the page that you're on, and you can click on housing needs by state, and it would take you to another page and where you'll select the state that you're interested in looking at, and it'll put the assessment data, the assessment of housing needs for that state. So bringing up all of this data and accessing data and the coalition's assessment of the need for housing for a number of reasons. In particular, it's very helpful to have data as part of your advocacy because it points to the fact that the issue that they're speaking about is very real. So we encourage folks to look at the data and to incorporate it when they're talking to their local officials, state officials, even those that are representing you at the US Congress. And so this data can be helpful for policies to protect renters or to keep renters in place, for creation of new affordable housing, or for just engaging your elected officials about how your community is built and what building community looks like. So we talked about the need for affordable housing, but now we're going to transition into what are the consequences of this this gap in the need for affordable housing and the consequences of evictions. So in response to COVID, the primary housing response has been to keep people housed. Prior to the vaccine, and even now, social distancing measures have helped to bend the curve. Generally, an eviction can result in fewer housing options even prior to COVID. That makes it more difficult for a person to secure decent, safe, and sanitary and affordable housing. The difficulty is then further compounded if a member of the family has a criminal record, or if there's a member of the family who has a disability, or if the family itself is large. And then there are also some additional complications if the family is evicted and there's an associated debt with that eviction. Having few housing options forces families to live in unsafe conditions. In the time of COVID, that means in places where observing social distance protocols are made virtually impossible. In other instances, people are living in substandard conditions. Remaining housed has allowed families to practice social distancing to prevent contracting or spreading COVID-19, which at the moment, once again, has been the most effective public health measures used to flatten the curve. But those benefits of staying at home are eroded if the physical structure is not properly maintained. And where housing providers have only made emergency repairs during shelter-in-place orders, there is a potential of backlog of serious maintenance requests. Poor conditions such as mold infestation, defective plumbing places residents' physical and mental health at risk. Federal agencies have an obligation to ensure assisted properties meet their physical condition standards. Also, properties that are not subsidized by federal programs have an obligation to keep properties in habitable conditions as described by state and local policies. For those who have few housing options, housing conditions are a very real and present issue. Condition issues not only threaten the health of our neighbors, but they also threaten the number of available affordable units within our community. So now I will transition into the the CDC eviction moratorium. So towards the end of last year, I think sometime in the fall, Consumer Action hosted a webinar about the CDC eviction moratorium. So I just wanted to point folks back to that as a resource where we talked in a great deal more detail about the CDC eviction moratorium than I will discuss today. But I just wanted to give you an overview because, as I mentioned, keeping people housed and in place has been the primary housing response. So the use of an eviction moratorium, or the CDC issued its nationwide eviction moratorium on September 4th of 2020, citing its authority to take action to prevent the spread of communicable diseases. And so at the end of 2020, Congress extended the CDC's eviction moratorium so that the eviction moratorium would expire at the end of January. So at present time, I have to apologize. This slide says the eviction order protections expire March 31st, but currently at the present time, the CDC eviction moratorium is set to expire January 31st, 2021. So on day one, President Biden signed an executive order asking the CDC to extend the eviction moratorium. The CDC on the 21st did acknowledge that it plans to extend the moratorium up into March 31st, 2021. So that's why it says March 31st, 2021. So I say all that to say the CDC enacted a moratorium in September. It was subsequently extended by Congress, and we expect the CDC to extend the eviction moratorium once again with the final expiration date to be March 31st, 2021. So typically, the federal law is not involved in determining if someone can be evicted, except for where the unit is federally subsidized or if there's a fair housing issue. Landlord-tenant law is largely a function of state and local law. Eviction hearings are primarily heard by state judges or justice of the peace. So once again, I say all of this to say that the CDC order, although it is a federal law, it is being implemented and enforced throughout the country the way that it's being implemented and enforced looks very different throughout the country. Most folks were surprised that the CDC issued this eviction moratorium, but once again, they're doing this under their authority to prevent the spread of communicable diseases, which has, as we discussed, keeping people housed has been able to allow folks to socially distance. So once again, I want to note here it says the order of protection expires March 31st, 2021. We expect that to be true. We expect for the CDC to extend the eviction moratorium, but as it stands right now, the CDC has not yet done the extension, but we expect for it to happen sometime this week or over the holiday. So the CDC order, what does it do? The order prohibits a landlord, owner of a residential property or their agents from evicting any covered person from a residential property where the CDC order applies. The order does allow for evictions based on other specified conduct as listed here. The order defines eviction and evict as any action taken that would cause or result in the removal of a covered person from the residential property. The moratorium does not waive the obligation to pay rent. In fact, covered persons must make best efforts to pay at least a portion of their rent in a timely manner. Additionally, landlords can charge late fees and other late fees and fines associated with folks paying their rent late or not paying their rent at all. So I would also note, though, those fees that are assessed, once again, a covered person cannot be evicted for the non-payment of those fines and fees, but still, they are obligated to pay them. Okay, so who is protected under this CDC order? To trigger these protections, a tenant, leasee, or a resident of a residential property must submit a signed declaration to their landlords, and that declaration must be signed and delivered under the penalty of perjury. So essentially, the family signs this declaration saying that they meet these criteria as listed on the slide, and that they acknowledge that if they are lying about their ability to meet this criteria, that they could be subject to the penalties of perjury. So the CDC order is effective in all states. This is now including America Samoa. So previously, America Samoa was excluded, but now it applies to all states and territories. And so once a tenant has sent the declaration to their landlord, the tenant may remain in the property up until the eviction moratorium expires, even if they're delinquent in rent or paying fines or fees associated with non-payment or late payment of rent. There is no deadline for submitting the declaration, except it must be submitted prior to any last owner action that is required to have the covered person removed. So also, because the CDC eviction moratorium was extended, for those who previously submitted their declaration in 2020, they should not be required to submit another declaration. The moratorium, as I mentioned, applies in all states and territories. The order also does, so the order is we characterize the order as a floor, meaning that the protections included in the order, that's the minimum protections. States and local jurisdictions should, and they can, I should have said, jurisdictions can, and they should, enact additional protections. So where the state and the local area have instituted public health protections that are the same or more protective than the order, then the jurisdiction will defer to those local protections. But where the CDC order is more protective, the area will defer to the CDC order. So the CDC order applies to all residential properties, whether they're subsidized or not. They must observe this moratorium. The moratorium applies to all residential rentals. This includes any house, like single-family homes, apartments, mobile homes, land in a mobile park home, and any other similar dwelling lease for residential purposes. Unfortunately, the order does not apply to rentals used as temporary guests or seasonal tenants as defined under the state law. So what happens when the moratorium expires? Essentially, the short answer is rent will become due. So when rent will become due will be a function of state and local law. For instance, some jurisdictions have made rent that back rent that has accrued during a certain period of time as they've recharacterized it as non-evictable debt, meaning that a family who had rent during that specific period of time in which they didn't pay, the family will continue to have the obligation to make that payment on the debt, but they can't be evicted for the debt. But in most jurisdictions, that's not the case. Families will have evictions filed against them soon thereafter any expiration of after the federal eviction moratorium and any state or local eviction moratorium. So I would note that the Biden administration is hoping that Congress will improve and extend the eviction moratorium through September of this year. So quickly, I just wanted to discuss other housing-related responses to COVID. On his first day, President Biden also asked the Department of Veteran Affairs, the Department of Agriculture, and HUD to consider extending their foreclosure moratoriums for federally backed mortgages and to continue applications for forbearances for those mortgages. So far, the FHA and Rural Development have done so. In addition to the CDC eviction moratorium, the federal government has funded emergency rental assistance, as well as further funded federal housing programs, federal homeless service programs. I would just note, even though there is money for emergency rental assistance and money for these federal programs, most likely it will not completely meet the need for families that are struggling to pay rent or struggling to access a place to live. So turning to the state, advocates have been able to advocate for policies that not only keep families in place at the state and local level, but they've also looked to the future to implement policies that will dampen the effects of COVID post-crisis. Things like right to counsel, just cause eviction, and making rental arrears non-evictable debt. Also, prohibition on income discrimination. I'd also like to note, like at the federal government, they are allocating the money for emergency rental assistance as well as for the federal homeless services programs, but it's at the state and local program where those programs are actually structured and administered. So the advocacy to improve your local rental assistance programs or your local homeless service programs have to happen at the local level with the local stakeholders. And then quickly, I just wanted to share, in addition to Consumer Action's wonderful resources, NHLP also has some resources on our website. So here, this is a picture of our homepage. At the top, you'll see in the banner, it says COVID-19. If you click on that COVID-19 button, it will take you to NHLP's resources, as well as resources that we've linked to resources of our partners that we've linked on our website. In particular, I just wanted to highlight that on this webpage, you can find our analysis of the CDC order. You can also see a CDC order FAQ for renters that is in both English and Spanish. We also have links to other language interpretations of the CDC order, as well as the declaration page. And then also guidance about access to rental assistance for those who are immigrants. I also wanted to point out some resources separate from COVID that we have on our page. So once again, at the top, you can see a button that says Resource Center. If you click that button, you will find our resources about the federal housing programs. So under the web pages for each federal program, we have a list of the federal laws that apply to those programs, as well as agency guidance for those programs, as well as NHLP trainings and other resources about those programs. And then my last slide before I turn it over to Sam, I just once again wanted to call out very specific resources that, if you're interested in today's webinar, might be helpful in your work and your advocacy. So first we have, I called out the previous resources that I mentioned about the CDC order that we have on our website, as well as here, the second bullet point, a list of resources in regards to finding COVID-related resources. So some of our colleagues created a map of state eviction moratoriums. So that's important because the federal eviction moratorium is just one piece of the puzzle. States and local jurisdictions can also enact their own eviction moratorium, and they're very important, especially when we're worried about the extension of the federal eviction moratorium. The coalition also has a database that you can use to find where or what are the emergency rental assistance programs within your community. And then there are the links to the resources about accessing rental assistance for those who are immigrants. And then the final third category of items, once again, the link to the coalition's study called The Gap that assesses the need for affordable housing at the national as well as state level. Another link to housing needs by state by the coalition, and the preservation database. And the preservation database is really awesome because you can look up specific properties and learn what type of assistance, what type of federal assistance and sometimes state assistance that is associated with the property, which is super helpful when you're trying to do detailed analysis about what's in your community. And with that, I'll turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Ms. Simmons. Thank you. Mr. Gilman, before I turn it over to you, I have a quick question for you. Ms. Simmons mentioned that the Biden administration extended national eviction. He requested that the CDC extend their national eviction moratorium. But do renters need more help beyond a pause on evictions? That's my question to you. Take it away. You have control.
Thanks for the question, Ms. Williams, and it's really an honor to follow Bridgett Simmons. I've been using the Green Book for a while, and it truly is, as Ms. Williams said in the introduction, a Bible. And just really appreciate all of you who are attending here today, this really important conversation on the eviction crisis and what we need to do to respond. So, Ms. Williams, to answer your question directly, yes, renters need more. And to answer the big picture question, are we facing an eviction tsunami? The answer is also yes, unless we do enough to stop it. And so my presentation today will share a little bit more about the eviction crisis by the numbers. It will attempt to frame the policy challenge around stopping evictions, how moratoria and the CDC moratorium that Ms. Simmons covered plays with rental assistance. And then the third piece, as we all know, good policy is important, but implementation is also important. And so I'll seek to cover how rental assistance and eviction moratoria can be implemented in tandem to stabilize households, not only through the pandemic, but to prevent that tsunami, or insert natural disaster metaphor, that could happen at the end of the pandemic when society chooses to go back to normal. And I think the message that I'd like to emphasize there is, with good policy, we can make sure to avoid that disaster. It would be an unnatural disaster, but it's very much looming if we don't avoid it. So I'm going to move forward and just do a quick introduction to the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project. We were formed in response, as the name suggests, to the COVID crisis. My co-founder, Zach Newman, and I were, as the crisis hit, realizing just how much the pandemic could impact renters, clients of CDP, and how important it was to put numbers around how big of an eviction crisis this could be. Sometimes, measurement allows policy change to move forward. And so we put together a number of estimates around the number of folks who are at risk of eviction. Here on this page, you can see one of our estimates from the end of the summer that we did in conjunction with the Aspen Institute and a number of really amazing researchers. You'll see Emily Benfer, who's a professor who studies the eviction moratoria. You'll see folks from City Life Vida Urbana, an amazing community organization in Massachusetts. It's Lisa Owens and David Bloom Robinson, Stacey Butler in Arizona, who leads a access to justice organization, colleagues at the Aspen Institute, Neil Steinkamp, who has done a number of the projections, and Diane Yentl, who's the CEO of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which you heard so much about in the previous presentation. So moving forward, one more bit of background on the COVID-19 Eviction Defense Project. Our mission is really simple. It's to keep Coloradans and Americans housed. And our model is integrated. We use what we call a managed care approach, which centers our clients, the individuals who are at risk of eviction and housing insecurity. And we try to provide a comprehensive suite of representation and advocacy and financial services in order to preserve as many tenancies as possible and move towards a world where nobody's evicted because they can't pay the rent, especially in a pandemic. So 4 major elements. One, we've got a law firm. This represents clients directly and provides legal guidance. 2, we have the think tank, which I'll talk more about our data piece. 3, the advocacy org. And 4, the housing fund, where our goal is to pair legal services and those imminently facing eviction with rental assistance. And we find a lot of the insights that I'll talk about come through more clearly for us when these pieces are working in tandem. Our housing fund came directly from the practice of representing tenants, and we're based in Colorado, where landlord-tenant law is the 42nd or 43rd worst for tenants in the country. And oftentimes our lawyers say that their job is to deliver bad news. We launched a housing fund so that they would have more tools, rental assistance to stabilize households and preserve more tenancies, directly rooted in the experience of representing clients and being unable to stabilize tenancies when the moratoria were not in place. So here's the data. This data is from the end of November, early December. The Census Bureau puts out additional data every few weeks, though they paused over the holidays. The headline is that almost 20% of tenants report being behind on their rent. This enormous number of almost 1 in 5, of 1 in 6 tenants who are behind on rent means in most places that these tenants can be evicted. They're at risk of losing their homes because most eviction law allows landlords the remedy of removing people from their homes when they can't pay rent. 18% translates into over 8 million households and an estimated 19 million people in those households. More adding to the worry, 32 million people and 13.4 million households say that they have slight or no confidence in their ability to pay rent the next month. And this number is a number that the Census Bureau describes as housing insecurity. These are people who are not sure whether they can pay rent next month. And of course, when people miss a rent payment, they become at risk of eviction. I'll add that the pandemic crisis has impacted the US economy unevenly. It's shed more than 10 million jobs, and the unemployment rate for the bottom quartile, tracktherecovery.org has really good data on this, is almost 20% fewer jobs in the bottom quartile, many of whom are disproportionately renters, or this quartile is disproportionately renters, demonstrating the lack of the ability of renters to recover, or a significant portion of renters to recover with earned income at the moment. Moving forward, it's important to understand that the housing insecurity that we are seeing first is built on a history of inequity, is built on, as Ms. Simmons covered, is built on deep housing unaffordability that is disproportionate in Black and Brown communities. And here you'll notice that more than 1 in 4 Black families are behind on rent. About 1 in 4 Hispanic or Latino families are behind on rent. More than 2 in 5, 40% are concerned or housing insecure. And the other deep tragedy among serious suffering visible on the slide is that households with children are disproportionately at risk of eviction and disproportionately behind on rent. So moving forward, I wanted to quantify the amount that tenants owe because it helps frame the challenge. It's not only that individuals are at risk of eviction because they're behind on rent, it's that we have to figure out how to solve the rental debt problem in America to avoid this eviction tsunami that we are facing on the other end if we do not solve the rental debt problem. So various estimates exist in the 24 to 70 billion range. Actually, just yesterday, the authors of the 70 billion number came out with an updated analysis through the Urban Institute at 57 billion in rental debt. And the Biden administration has allocated 25 billion. So there's still, at best, we were break even as of January 1st, but of course the first of the month is always less than 31 days away, or we're still in a hole even in terms of allocation of rental assistance if you use the newest numbers of 57 billion of well over $25 billion, well over $30 billion. Spinning forward, I wanted to just highlight the consequences, and I know Ms. Simmons did this as well, of eviction. And this is important because it's important on a number of levels to level set how much of a human rights crisis a mass eviction crisis can be, and often how much of a crisis an eviction can be for families. And it's also important for advocacy to tell the story, to help people understand the stakes. You can see the sum of the suffering that can occur due to eviction here on the slide. And I want to also throw out a couple stats from a new paper yesterday for pandemic-related eviction that folks at the National Bureau of Economic Research estimated that if there had been a full eviction moratorium in place throughout the duration of the pandemic, that we could have seen 14% fewer cases of COVID and more than 40% fewer deaths. More than 40% fewer deaths estimated if we had actually invested in keeping folks in their homes comprehensively. And I lay out that research because it's useful in advocacy, and it also frames what we have to do moving forward on, and how important the stakes are, that housing is healthcare, and housing is a true pandemic response and a true cornerstone. Without it, huge consequences exist for families intergenerationally and for society. So to talk a little bit about solutions, now that I've framed the policy challenge and told the story with numbers, and Ms. Simmons covered some of these as well, the major solutions have focused on 3 areas, though there have been a few other solutions that folks are pushing alongside it. Payment agreements, and these eviction moratoria, and rental assistance. Payment agreements encourage landlords and tenants to voluntarily agree to flatten the arrearages over time. The tenants can pay back their debts over time. But of course, they don't provide any additional resources to tenants to stabilize. The two most common that we've seen are eviction moratoria and rental assistance. They work really well in tandem. They are mutually reinforcing. Eviction moratoria keep roofs over people's heads. The more comprehensive they are, the fewer loopholes they are, the more they do to preserve tenancies to keep people housed, and the fewer burdens that they put on tenants. The risk, of course, and Ms. Simmons covered this as well, is that there's a payments cliff at the other end. The CDC moratorium and most moratoria that have been put in place don't waive rent. Most also don't come in tandem with the conversion of household debt that is evictable to civil debt, as Ms. Simmons mentioned. And so we've got the question of how do we bring tenants to current so that the eviction risk can be permanently cured, that it for that tenant that they can avoid the risk, and that's where rental assistance comes in. It can pay back rent, it can pay future rent, and it allows to clear the balances, moving away that risk of eviction. So there are billions on the way. There's $25 billion that is hitting states across the country. The National Low Income Housing Coalition has good resources on where that funding is going and how much by state. The passage of that rental assistance was coupled with an extension of the eviction moratorium through January 31st by Congress. And as Ms. Simmons mentioned, there is an expectation and an announcement from the CDC that they will be extending the CDC moratorium through the 31st of March. Now, it's also important to mention, and this is a place where advocacy is critical, the National Low Income Housing Coalition is leading on this point as well. The moratorium doesn't cover all types of evictions. It covers non-payment evictions. It stops if tenants are affirmatively declare that they are protected under the eviction. It stops the execution of the evictions. It certainly prevents them. However, the loopholes allow evictions to proceed. And Eviction Lab at Princeton, Matthew Desmond and team have been tracking more than 200,000 evictions, even in the regions and cities that they're tracking, have been going forward. And so there's additional work to be done to strengthen moratoria at the local and national, local and state levels on top of the national moratorium, and further additional work with the Biden administration to see if they will strengthen the moratorium first initiated under the Trump administration. I've already shared a little bit more about the debts, that have been accruing, and President Biden has been calling for $30 billion more in rental assistance, as well as extending the eviction ban, as Ms. Simmons mentioned, through September. And so the 30 billion plus 20 billion would go a long way towards chipping at the arrearages, at the debts that Mark Sandy and the Urban Institute study estimated the 57 billion. But even there, we're going to need more rental assistance over time, because the first of the month is always coming up, and we are not through the pandemic yet. Moving forward, the other thing that's really important here from both an advocacy perspective and a consumer perspective is how we implement this. $25 billion is not enough to cover the arrearages, but it's also an enormous amount of money in infrastructure that hasn't been developed sufficiently to distribute this money quickly, and there are huge barriers to distribution of rental assistance that are making these programs slow to distribute money, and the consequences for families. You don't get to undo an eviction if the money arrives too late. And so as consumer advocates, as concerned citizens, there's a lot of advocacy on how to make these processes simpler, on how to ensure that these systems are well resourced enough to get money out the door to people faster. And I'm going to end my talk by talking about implementation and some of the ways that we can do that. I'll also mention that the National Housing Law Project has a great write-up on the federal legislation that authorized the $25 billion in rental assistance. It's helpful to frame what the legislation calls for and the requirements of the legislation and the bare minimum required by the legislation for administering funds under the program. We published a piece, and this will be in the materials after the conversation with the Aspen Institute, on 4 core principles for distributing rental assistance designed to maximize the effectiveness and the equity of the programs. I'll quickly cover the 4, and the publication covers more of this in detail. The first is to create strong legal and policy frameworks to support agreement. Eviction moratoria not only preserve tenancies, but they also heighten the cost of eviction to landlords, which encourages them to accept rental assistance that is on the way. When the moratoria extends into March, a landlord has choices around or has an incentive to collectively work with their tenant to get rental assistance so that they can pay their bills and pay the mortgage. Additionally, conversion of evictable debt to non-evictable debt through civil debt conversion is another really important legal and policy framework to stabilize tenancies, while of course recognizing what was owed by the tenants. Rental assistance can of course go to those arrearages. The second is to market extensively a simple and accessible application process. This is critical, making sure that the application is accessible in multiple languages, that it is marketed to communities and to low-income renters, to folks who need rental assistance, is essential to ensuring that distribution is equitable and that folks who need it the most know where to find it. Washington State has had a great model of working with organizations that they call buy-in for organizations, buy-in for communities of color, to make sure that the rental assistance application and funds are equitably distributed. The third is to ensure that rental assistance payment terms promote long-term housing stability rather than loss absorption. A couple quick notes on this. What I mean by that is that rental assistance should pay future rent as well as back rent. When the government is paying folks rent, they should be buying rental stability for the household as well as helping landlords cover the debts. When they don't do that, we're essentially saying as a society that we can cover the arrearages, but we're not going to stabilize the tenancy moving forward. And both are important investments, not only from both are important investments from an eviction defense standpoint. The last piece, and from a household stabilization standpoint, the last piece is to provide support to tenants after the rental assistance has been paid and monitor, so that if there are additional conditions issues, if there are other issues, or a landlord chooses to move to evict, even after accepting the rental assistance, tenants know where and how to access assistance to ensure that that doesn't happen. Here are a few more details about our recommendations. I'm not going to go into all of them now because I know that there may be a bunch of questions, but you can find it in our report with the Aspen Institute, Best Practices for Distribution of Rental Assistance, and the National Low Income Housing Coalition also has a really tremendous best practices guide that supplements and should be looked at in tandem. I covered a lot of the pieces of the supporting landscape, so here are some more details for folks. The supporting policies that we can advocate for can ensure that rental assistance prevents eviction. It can ensure that rental assistance dollars have time to get in tenants' pockets, and can ensure that households are stabilized, and these funds have time to work. Massachusetts recently imposed a new eviction moratorium that said anybody who had applied for rental assistance could not be evicted until the rental assistance was processed. Of course, we'd like a more comprehensive moratorium from a stability standpoint, but that type of policy at least ensures that folks who are seeking rental assistance can in fact get access to it and aren't at risk of eviction because of slow processing. Here are a few states that have done innovative programs in the first wave of rental assistance distribution, and we've done some work to categorize some of the best practices, and you can find that in our publication, which will be in the materials sent out afterwards. And we also, on our website and here on this slide, continually tabulate data on the number of renters who are behind on rent and who could be at risk of eviction by state in both household and individual renter terms for advocacy purposes. So that concludes my presentation on the data. I'll just note, coming back to the initial question, as you all see, we are facing an eviction tsunami, but there is a large set of policies that we can put in place that combines eviction protections like eviction moratoria and rental assistance that can seriously reduce, if not prevent, that disaster. And it's a matter of policy action and political will to get that done.
Well, thank you. Didn't I tell you to get ready to be amazed? Ms. Simmons, Mr. Gilman, thank you so much for your presentations. Now let's go to Nelson and see if we have any questions.
Yes, Linda, hello. We do have questions for our speakers, and I will go ahead and give you the first one. Somebody is asking, why is it acceptable at a federal level, at least, to place a moratorium on evictions as opposed to freezing rent and mortgages and then dispersing federal funds to defray those debts? Has there ever been a movement to freeze these costs to low-income housing residents?
I believe Ms. Simmons, here she goes.
So I'm understanding the question to be, why isn't the federal government stopping future rent to become due?
Whether there's a movement to freeze rent and mortgages and then disperse funds to defray those debts.
So I'm sure, I don't really actually have an answer to that. I'm sure the federal government would be very cautious in doing that in fear of overstepping their authority. So that would have to be my answer today. I'm not sure in terms of what are the other options the federal government, what they assessed were their other options in terms of, so some groups have been asking for canceling of rent and canceling of mortgage payments, which I think sounds similar to what this person is asking, of essentially, why doesn't the federal government just make those payments on behalf of folks? So I think typically the federal government is very cautious when it does something.
I guess the one thing that I'd add, and maybe this isn't directly answering the question either, but the federal government might get closer to, the federal government issues guidance on top of the legislation about what requirements states need to comply with as they allocate rental assistance dollars. And there might be an ability in advocacy around what those requirements should be to make the implementation process less restrictive and therefore get more folks access. But broadly, I would agree with the concern about overstepping their authority. And that said, states have an ability to supplement the floors on eviction and to supplement policies that the federal government has passed to further stabilize tenancies and make it more accessible to folks.
Great, thank you. Then somebody's asking, does the moratorium impact tenants if their lease was not renewed because they were past due on rent?
So in NHLP's interpretation of what it means to evict, we would say the eviction moratorium would apply to all no-cause evictions and all non-renewal of leases. But as I mentioned in my presentation, the way in which the CDC eviction moratorium has been interpreted differently in the jurisdictions throughout the country. And so unfortunately, in some jurisdictions, they have allowed for those type of evictions to move forward. And Sam, I remember you mentioning it in your presentation, and it's something that you've been seeing.
Yeah, in Colorado, lease expirations evictions for expiring leases can go forward. The governor supplemented the CDC moratorium for several months this fall that closed loopholes like this and banned evictions for tenants who are on month-to-month leases whose leases had expired. But that moratorium expired at the beginning of January, and the interpretation then, at least in Colorado courts, has been that landlords do have the ability and the right to evict tenants under those circumstances.
Well, kind of related, somebody is asking, what are the most common loopholes that still allow evictions in spite of the moratorium? What are the most common loopholes?
I can start, and Ms. Simmons, please come in as well. I think the biggest loophole isn't even necessarily a loophole. It's that renters need to know that they are protected, and this is why conversations like this are so important, because every one of the attendees here can be a part of the outreach team or a part of the folks who know about this. Tenants need to affirmatively know about their protections under the moratorium and declare that they meet the criteria of the moratorium and declare that to their landlords prior to the execution of the eviction. And so there's a lot of folks who hear that on the news, and we've gotten calls from people in having this experience who hear on the news that Joe Biden is extending the eviction moratorium and believe that means that they don't have something that they need to do to claim protection. And unfortunately, that's not the case. Tenants do need to affirmatively claim protection under the moratorium. A couple other loopholes that we've seen: the expiration of leases, month-to-month leases, and potentially sometimes minor lease violations. We've seen some landlords moving on that account as well. Ms. Simmons, I don't know what else you have seen or you would add to that.
Yeah, so the only other thing is in the PowerPoint, we mentioned that the CDC allows for certain evictions to move forward. And so just like with the lease violations, a owner may try to characterize tenant behavior to meet one of those type of categories, where in normal instances, one would not try to make that characterization. So ditto to everything that Sam said, but also have to be looking for unfair characterizations of behavior.
Thank you. One other question that we have here is whether there's any assistance for HOA fees, homeowners association fees during COVID-19.
So I haven't heard of assistance for HOA fees. At the federal government, they've provided relief for folks who have federally backed mortgages. And so I'm not quite sure if relief for the mortgage would then, if the expectation is relief for the mortgage would help free up funds for HOA.
Yeah, I also don't know beyond, though I'll say a number of states have also used in the past coronavirus relief dollars, which are very flexible funds for, in addition to rental assistance, for housing assistance for homeowners. And so I think the answer, it's possible that the answer varies by jurisdiction and by different states' interpretations of and different state programs around how those dollars meant to stabilize homeowners who are behind on their mortgages can be spent.
Great, thank you. And then today was mentioned the FHA, VA, and USDA regarding delay in foreclosures. Not mentioned were Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, which maybe are also delaying foreclosures still. Do you have any information on where things stand with these federal agencies or federal entities?
That's a question I would have to follow up on. I don't know off of the top of my head.
Okay, great. And then another question is the use of Chapter 13. If people file Chapter 13, or if agencies, Chapter 13 filed by agencies to help needy families, can it be used to protect them from eviction? If yes, will information, do you have any information on this for people in this situation?
So the question is about the use of bankruptcy to keep folks housed. So I know that is a strategy that some advocates have been using. I am not well versed in what that process looks like, but that is, some advocates have been using in some instances the use of bankruptcy to help their clients.
Okay, thank you. And somebody's asking, is there some type of program like PPE for homeowners so that they can pay their mortgage to save rental properties and set up payment plans for renters while renters can still seek rental assistance?
I'll say that a lot of the rental assistance programs go through the landlord, and so the one that comes immediately to mind for me is the property owner preservation program in Colorado, but a number of states have versions of this, and the landlords can actively work with their tenants. And in fact, these programs are a lot easier to access when both parties participate and the landlord wants to drive the process. They submit an application to the state, they get a declaration on behalf of their tenant that the tenant is in need of rental assistance. They submit information about the lease and how much the tenant owes, and the program processes rental assistance on behalf of the tenant, paid directly to the landlord. And a number of states have programs like this. Massachusetts, for example, does require landlords to participate in the rental assistance process as well. Washington State too. So landlords have options to facilitate this process on behalf of tenants who are behind.
Great, thank you. And then a couple of people want to find resources that you mentioned. I think you mentioned both of these, Sam, or it may have been the same resource. Somebody's saying you mentioned that it was a report that you received yesterday. You mentioned it by name, but they wanted a little bit more info to find that, and it was just something you mentioned as having received yesterday. And then somebody says a report that you mentioned about 40% of COVID cases that were due to evictions. So those two reports, or that report, how do people find those?
Yep, so there were two reports that I think came out yesterday, or at least I read yesterday. The first is an Urban Institute publication, and Nelson, I can send these to you after our conversation today, and we can distribute as well, but it was an Urban Institute publication written by Mark Zandi and a co-author, estimating the number of, or the amount of rental debt in the economy at 57 billion. So Urban Institute, Mark Zandi, 57 billion should get you there, but I am happy to send it out afterwards. And then the second publication that I referenced was the National Bureau of Economic Research. There was a study that they released yesterday, a series of co-authors that found 40% of COVID-related deaths could have been decreased up to 40% with comprehensive eviction protections. And that study comes on the heels, and that's the National Bureau of Economic Research. The study comes on the heels of earlier research by Emily Benfer and her team finding that eviction moratoria statistically saved lives during the pandemic. And the other thing I'd mention, if you want to easily find that, I tweeted it out yesterday at Gilman Sam, and have a little thread where it's the first article in the thread.
Thanks, that's fantastic. Just backing up a little bit, somebody's asking if maybe Bridgett, if you could tell us again, what is a covered person under the CDC order? Everyone in the house? Is it people on the lease only? Who's a covered person?
Yeah, so a covered person is an individual who submits a declaration attesting to them meeting the eligibility requirement. So it says, so they must be able to assert that they made within a certain amount within 2020, that they will use their best efforts to pay a portion of the full rent in a timely manner, that they're unable to pay the rent in full at the designated time, that if they were evicted, they would likely become homeless or be forced to live in close quarters, such as like shared housing or in a shelter or other places where congregate housing. And so they have to meet these criteria of the declaration, and they submit it to the landlord. So one piece is, can one adult submit it on behalf of everyone in the property? And in the CDC's guidance, they encourage each adult who is on the lease to submit the declaration to their landlord, but it's not required, meaning one adult could submit the declaration to cover the entire household. Additionally, the CDC moratorium, the original order, as well as the subsequent extension, has come with it attached a declaration form that meets the required language, right? So an applicant could potentially just sign that declaration form and submit it to their landlord. I mention it to say folks are not obligated to submit the declaration form that is attached to the actual order. They have to submit a signed declaration that meets the language as described in the CDC order. So I say all that to say, one person could submit the declaration on behalf of the entire household. The declaration itself has to just mimic the language. The declaration that people sign, the language of that document has to mimic the language of the order. And then finally, how the declaration is submitted to the landlord. The order doesn't describe the required way in which a tenant is to give the signed declaration to their landlord. So that means it could be mailed in, it could be emailed. We just encourage that when folks submit their declaration, that they receive back a way to memorialize that the landlord received my declaration on this date at this time.
Great, thank you. And then I'm not sure, of course, this varies by state, I'm sure, but someone's just asking generally, if a tenant is evicted for overdue rent, what kind of obligation do they have to pay back that rent? And how does it affect them when they're trying to find a new place? This is probably very common.
So when a family is evicted, they will have an obligation to pay the back rent. And so how does that impact their future access to affordable housing is typically if someone has an eviction, that will be on their renter's history. So if your landlord asks for your renter's history, that will show up, and that will typically disincentivize the new landlord for wanting you to be a tenant. And once again, I mentioned having an eviction on your record. It is one of several elements that can complicate someone's access to housing. So for example, if someone simply has come in contact with the criminal legal system, whether they've been convicted of a crime or simply, or in some cases arrested of a crime, that can also really deeply impact their ability to access housing. So when you combine the eviction as well as someone's previous interaction or contact with the criminal legal system, or a family member having a disability, or a family being large, it makes housing options just way more fewer. And then in this current system that we have, landlords have a lot of discretion about who they rent to.
The other thing that I would add, and this is one of the major problems among many with the system, is that oftentimes a filing of an eviction, even if it isn't ordered by a judge, can make it more difficult for tenants to rent a new property. That information can be harvested by the bureaus, the rental bureaus, the background check folks, and can be on a tenant's record. There's a lot of movement in states around the country to seal eviction filing records from those credit bureaus and tracking bureaus to at least prevent that piece of history from impacting tenants. California, I believe, has a good law. Colorado just implemented its version this year during the pandemic. I also mention this because it's important to understand the flip side too, that lots of displacements happen before a judge orders that somebody must leave their home at the end of an eviction process, at the end of the summary process. And one of the things we highlight a lot for our clients is when they receive a demand on their door, that they don't have to go until a judge orders that they have to leave. And so the eviction crisis that we're seeing is an eviction, is in some sense better known or better understood as an eviction and displacement crisis, because some processes might begin with the legal process of eviction, might not go all the way through the entire legal process with the court, but tenants might end up leaving their homes as a result of the non-payment. And I think it's important to understand the features and the texture of how this may play out for a lot of folks, particularly undocumented folks experience higher rates of displacement outside of the legal system around eviction after a landlord will threaten that they are going to commence proceedings or they put a demand on the door.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a question that I think is probably maybe on the mind of a lot of participants. This is someone in New York, but it'd be great to know an answer for everyone. What is the website? What is the best website to check in your state to find other protections for tenants besides the national moratorium? Is there someone? Oh, go ahead.
So on our website, we have a link to a resource that is tracking state eviction moratoriums. Most of the state eviction moratoriums have expired, but some of the protections that were implemented are still effective. So in particular, thinking about in some jurisdictions, they have recharacterized back rent as non-evictable debt. To find other, so rental assistance, I think we both mentioned this, the National Low Income Housing Coalition, they have a rental assistance search feature. So you can search for rental assistance programs within your community. In terms of finding out about other changes in the law that relate to housing, I haven't seen a comprehensive database in regards to all of the changes in housing and landlord tenant policy. And so in those instances, my best recommendation is to reach out to a local legal service attorney who is practicing eviction defense, because they will know about all of the changes to state and local policy.
I just echo that last piece, that the local legal aid bureaus and local legal aid lawyers will know not only what are the changes in the law, but how they're being implemented in the state and where the best and most accessible resources are.
And then if you are unsure where to find a local legal aid organization, you can find an organization by going to the LSC website. So it's L as in Lima, S as in Sam, C as in cat.gov. And in the top right corner, it'll ask for your zip code, for you to enter your zip code into a search engine. And then from there, it'll tell you a local legal aid. And you can also probably search, the name of your area legal aid.
Excellent, thank you. And so we are running out of time for questions, but both of our speakers did provide their email addresses in the slides, which you'll get tomorrow, and you can follow up with questions or send them to us and we'll get them to them. Thank you, Linda. I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers.
Thank you, Nelson. And before I move on, if you're interested in agencies that collect and report eviction information on your clients, go to our COVID-19 page, click on webinars, and go to specialty consumer reports, and you will find the name and the contact information for agencies that collect that information and how you can get a report for your client. Thanks again to Ms. Simmons and Mr. Gilman for your great presentation and for answering all of the questions. I want to talk to you about upcoming webinars. I noticed that a few of you have not registered for our March 9th webinar on the impact of COVID-19 on food insecurities. We have Karen Washington, a farmer and an advocate who forged the path of Black farmers in America, joining us. It's going to be a great webinar. Our webinar, March 23rd webinar, our guest speaker is going to be Eva Bagquest of the Identity Theft Resource Center. So watch your inbox for all of the upcoming webinars for 2021. And again, this webinar is part of our COVID-19 educational project. Go to that website, download some of the fact sheets, and just check out some of the webinars we've had in the past. The impact of COVID-19 on domestic violence, I think it's hit 1,000 viewers. You may find it interesting. And again, if you want to contribute to consumer action, you can do so online by credit card, PayPal, and you can mail us that $5 check, that $10 check up, or that $15 check to us. Again, I want to give a special thanks to Mr. Simmons and Mr. Gilman for your great presentations. I mean, you guys rock. I told you to get ready to be amazed, and they did exactly that. And a special thanks to all of you for joining us today and for the work that you're doing in the communities that you serve. I look forward to welcome you back on March the 9th. In the meantime, I want you to stay safe and stay sane if you can. Thanks a lot, and goodbye.